Everyone again. I hope you had a good quick break, and we're going to get started again with the last part of our focus session, Confronting Environmental Crisis. And this is a hybrid event, as our whole conference is. So I want to welcome to the stage Jane Winchell, who is the Sarah Fraser Robbins Director of the Art and Nature Center and Curator of Natural History at the Peabody Essex Museum. And joining us from Miami online is artist Xavier Cortada, who's Professor of Practice in the Department of Art and Art History at the University of Miami. So welcome our conversation around confronting environmental crisis.
Thank you, Marianne. It is such a pleasure and honor to be here with all of you and with Xavier, and really appreciated the exchanges earlier this morning. So, and Xavier, I hope you were able to take part in that as well.
I did. I love Dr. Atkinson's walking us through anxiety, eco-anxiety, and ending with, I think, what a lot of our discussion, our conversation is going to be about, which is taking action.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah. And so I wanted to, I think, start off with you, Xavier, actually with a question that was similar to what Marianne was bringing to the panel, which was like, how did you get involved in doing climate work yourself and as an artist, a practicing artist?
Sure. Well, first of all, Danny, it's wonderful to be here, and it's great to be in a conversation with you, but also with all the other curators at this important time. And I just want to thank the association for spending a big chunk of its time on focusing on climate. I think that's the right thing to do. And it models, I think, as you and I are probably going to talk today, what I think museums, curators, artists, in fact, everyone needs to be focused on. For me, that focus began probably in its full capacity when a glaciologist buried ice that was going to melt Miami in my hands as part of the Antarctic Writers and Artists Fellowship in Antarctica back in 2006. But it really began 40 years before that. As a kid, I, the son of Cuban refugees, saw my dad, my uncle, use art to help the Cuban diaspora navigate and address political issues through the power of art. And then as a young man in Miami, as I saw the Miami of the 80s with so much violence and despair, I used my art in the 90s as a way of addressing racial, social inequity, a lot of work on gang violence, kids in adult prison, juvenile justice concerns. So by the time 2024 got around and I saw mangroves, the same mangroves that my dad would walk me through in Miami and remind himself of his fishing village in Cuba, be destroyed and mauled down, I need to use that social practice, those tools I use to address and problem solve social concerns and translate them into environmental remediation issues. And beyond that, now climate issues. What about you? How did you get involved with this climate-focused climate practice?
Well, like you, it goes back some decades of the awareness of this at a scientific level. I had training as an environmental scientist, and I really didn't know where to go with it. The concern being there and a feeling like it was so overwhelming. And it really wasn't until I was at the Peabody Essex Museum and was involved in heading up developing this Art and Nature Center, which was an interactive space, interdisciplinary, intergenerational, that I started to feel I had to do something. And so that was kind of that's where the feeling like, okay, well, how do we interweave these ideas and not make the focus on climate change, but like, okay, we'll sprinkle things in here. And I think that actually this is a good moment to talk about the project that we were involved in together. Let's see. So this was the exhibition that I was able to bring Xavier in at the Peabody Essex Museum back in 2008 with the Art Nature Center. We focus on exhibitions that we can leave up for a longer time. We incorporate interactives, we work with multiple artists. And there was a historical perspective exhibition going on at the same time about the poles. And so this was our opportunity to work with contemporary artists and looking at landscape, ice, people, wildlife. And this was where I found that Xavier was doing work with, my first encounter was seeing his work with melting ice. And that was something I wanted to be bringing in at an emotional level, the feeling of these are not permanent. The South Pole is not permanent. We think of it being something that will never go away. And Xavier's work really, I feel like you spoke to that, to me anyway, at a visceral level. And then you were generous in allowing us to use some of the works from that series. And then also you came up and participated in our opening festivities at the museum. So I think we have a slide of that as well. And why don't you speak, because the ice paintings were part of a broader body of work, obviously.
Sure. So the ice paintings, and they may look familiar to most of your audience because now they're wearing them. I hope on their shirts, on their chests. But the ice paintings were created in Antarctica with Antarctica and informed by the scientists of Antarctica. And I literally just took pieces of paper and I melted them. I literally put them on little pieces of 9 by 12 paper. I had no idea I was going to do this when I came to Antarctica. But I was in fact, I went there with paintbrushes, whole full palette of warm colors. I don't know why. And I didn't wind up using a paintbrush. I just literally had the ice melt. And I remember with your programming, we actually replicated that. We had communities from across the Salem area also look at ice and inside the museum replicate these ice paintings, that experiential activity. This other piece here was important. There's a piece called Longitude Installation. As you remember, I did these performances at the South Pole in 2007, but then in the North Pole in 2008. And these were shoes that I put and aligned along 24 time zones, along the longitudes where 24 people lived and were impacted by climate. And I spoke those words. And in my mind, conceptually, I was trying to create proximity, empathy. We're very far away from each other on the world below. And remember, this is 2006 when we weren't even using words like climate change. Like it was something that was really not in the vocabulary of the mainstream population. And for others, it felt too remote. And I just wanted to make a point at the place where the longitudes converge, that all of us were in this together as a global community. So we spoke those 24 words. I was alone at the South Pole as a performative piece, but with the idea of having it come to museums like yours and have participants literally stand in the shoes of those who've also been impacted. Those words were spoken 15 years ago. I got them from newspaper articles back in 2006, 17 years ago. But we also asked your participants, if you remember, to come up with their own quotes, the 25th quote on how their lives had also been impacted by climate. And that was really a wonderful experience, Janie. Thank you for bringing it. And it's one that lives to the day, just like, if you want to go to the next slide, just like the ice paintings from 2006, 2007 have their life today. I took those very badges that everyone has been, so I think my assistant Adam Roberti is outside distributing badges to individuals. And I wanted the folks in COP26, the actual delegates who voted at the United Nations, to think of themselves not as nation states with their own political, economic, immediate here and now interest, but to actually think of themselves globally and their actions as impacting one another. So I had them reframe who they were and create a catalyst for conversation by having them talk about their hopes and their fears, about their future and their purpose. And for those who didn't know about their elevation, for me in Micronesia and Miami are at the same elevation. So we had a lot of dialogue and conversation with art as a catalyst to make that happen. So if you haven't done it yet, make sure you say hello and think of yourself in a different light. So that's what I did there, and I'm doing it now. What about you? What's happening? What's happening with you and with the Peabody? I loved, by the way, I loved the museum. I love the programming, and I just want to personally celebrate you for your years at the helm in bringing this kind of really important and relevant experiential programming. What are you up to now?
I think what emerged over time was the feeling that, and there were other exhibitions where we were sprinkling in opportunities for people to touch on these topics through, bio-inspired art and design, and a show earlier than that on trash menagerie. But then there came a point, and it sort of felt for me like an epiphany of like as hard as it seemed to have the focus be on the climate crisis for an intergenerational audience, and my concern that people won't come or this'll make things worse, that I just had to feel like I'll figure out the way to do this. But I had to make the commitment of like, I'm going to take this on and work with the team at PEM. And I feel like some of that was substantiated by, we were involved in a strategic plan where one of the things that came up through the body of the staff was that sustainability was a priority. And I think that sort of infused me in a way too that felt very different from just being the director of this Art and Nature Center to this sense of, oh, this really is our community. And we're approaching it from all different areas of the museum. And then as it turned out, we had this synchronicity, I guess, in a way of several exhibitions, which I'll just mention briefly in a moment, that allowed us to launch this climate and environment initiative at the museum, to have an outward facing aspect of this that was bringing the public into the conversation and to be activating people's agency. And also,
that's really important. Absolutely.
Yeah. And you've been doing so much with that. And then also inspiring creative solutions, which was wonderful. And hearing the presentations and panel earlier today, like this work that we all are doing and you all are doing, especially as in the art curatorial realm, is really important to accessing different aspects for people. And so Xavier, I'll just run through a couple of the current things we're doing now. So this is the exhibition that literally just opened a week ago, the Climate Action Inspiring Change, which is in the Art and Nature Center. And this is the anchor show for this series. There's actually 4 exhibitions on right now with this theme of climate and environment. And this one is really focused on the solutions side of things, offering a way for people to become more knowledgeable as climate citizens, because one of the things that we find is that there's just so much information, but what do you really like pay attention to, what really matters? And in the solutions arena, recognizing this was also something came up earlier, value systems matter. And so Indigenous value systems really have a place, and we have a need to be understanding these ideas of reciprocity and land use, how we use our land. So focusing on the solution side of things so people can use that to know where the key areas are for impact, and then operate from a place that they identify matters for them. So we protect what we love, which is something also that Jennifer Atkinson was speaking to earlier. And so it's not going to be the same for everybody, but that people find their pathway. So that's, I won't go on more on that. We can come back to it, but just in terms of the structure of this.
Yeah, I do think that that's exactly right. That's the role that museums can play in helping us understand and find, our path and the intersection of, what we're good at, what our what our passion is, and how we can come in and creatively problem solve. And I love that. I mean, I'm just peeking into your slide here, sort of be there and touch whatever's on that table. What else?
Yeah. Right. So food choices, and also seeing this at a systems level, not. It's individual, but this isn't about like having people feel shame, or it's more.
Absolutely.
It's like how we do things right now. That's really an issue. So then this down to the bone with Edward Corrin and Stephen Gorman is actually in the adjacent gallery, and it's a fairly small show, but it's focusing on the works of this famed cartoon artist for the New Yorker, Ed Corrin, and then the wildlife and nature photographer works by Stephen Gorman. They didn't do these together. They realized after the fact that they were talking about the same issues of environmental destabilization. And this show went up just a few weeks before Climate Action opened. And we had a number of people coming out of that. It has a lot of emotional impact with the polar bears surviving a period of time now while the sea ice is further and further out for longer and longer periods, and they're resorting to surviving on the Inupiat whale hunt remains. So we don't normally see polar bears in this setting. And so what came out of that, though, was a real sense from people coming out of the exhibit, like, what do we do? And so it reinforced for me, Xavier, that the aspect of that it's so important we don't leave people hanging from the precipice of something that's distressing, but that's somewhere in what we're doing in this, that we're folding in the action and hope, the threads for that. And then just quickly, the last one I'll mention right now is the Blue Trees with Konstantin Dimopoulos, which that also just opened this last week. And that was involving the community in coloring trees with a temporary biologically non-toxic blue pigment. And this in a way reminds me also some of the work that you're doing, Xavier, to like bring awareness to the forefront, because this was involving volunteers. It was also, of course, attracting a lot of attention from passersby, and they, why are you doing this? And Konstantin's message is really about, I want to make these trees visible so people see them, and from there recognize how critical this issue is. And we actually had a passerby, and while I was out there helping, he came up and said, well, why are you doing this, and so forth. And then he said, but these trees weren't here before. And this is like the main walking mall in Salem, and he had not seen them before. So he thought we must have planted them there, like they're 30-foot tall ginkgo trees. And so it just highlighted, and he was totally serious. I said, well, that's why we're doing this, because so many of us we're not seeing the trees, and, right. And the deforestation is happening where we're not seeing it. Anyway, enough about that.
No. I like the idea of making it strange. Absolutely. In fact, I make things very strange sometimes just to get a little attention. So I did these pieces here at the Rauschenberg residency back in 2015. And again, you have to remember where we were. I think all of us today are looking at climate, and I think there's this incredible consensus that there's a lot that needs to be done. But back then, when I took those two ice trays from Robert Rauschenberg's beach house, walked down the street and filled them with seawater, and then walked back upstairs and put them in his fridge, I had done more to protect my peninsula from rising seas than the governor of the state of Florida, who did not allow us to say the word climate change if we work within the system, within the state, to do anything about climate. So I, as an artist, tried to do everything I can to bring attention to this matter. And at the beginning, it was, there's a problem in a world full of deniers. Now I think the conversation, Janie, is becoming, okay, you accept the problem, but what are we really going to do about it? With the thing with the trees, I love it. As you know, if you go to the next slide, at the North Pole, I got to the North Pole using an icebreaker, and it got there in record time. It got there, I think, in 5 days. I hadn't seen it because the ice was so thin. If I were to try to redo this project in another 10, 15 years, I can probably get there by kayak, because unfortunately, what's happening to the Arctic sea ice is unconscionable. And by that, we of course mean unconscionable to biodiversity and to humans who will perish. So that's why I think you and I are working so hard. Back then, what I tried to do is a bioremediation effort. I really did. I wanted to keep, I don't know if you remember, but in 2007, there was this Russian submarine, and it had a little robotic arm, and it, as a colonial power, decided it was going to conquer the seabed beneath the North Pole, so it put a Russian flag. So I put a green flag on top of that to reclaim it for nature. And obviously, by sequestering carbon through the planting of trees, we would keep that ice from thinning. And therefore, Russia or any other one of the 14 nations that be for that space, for mining and for navigation, would find it an irrelevant conquest. But importantly, the green flag, just like the blue tree, is important, because had I just gotten people to plant native trees in their front yards, no one would have noticed. But here, what I do is I engage you, I teach you about why it's important to plant native trees. And then you signal that as a reverse conquistador by planting a green flag that is a catalyst. And I think that's important for conversation, so that the person who planted the tree now has agency to talk to grandmother or uncle or the neighbor across the street about that. And to me, that's really been my practice. I see you doing that at your museum, finding experiential ways of bringing people in, of giving them solutions. I initially did that with mangroves. If you go to the next slide, I just want to tell you really quickly about my reclamation project. That's a project, right at the beginning, I was talking about, driving down to the Keys and seeing these mangroves that my dad had taught me about from the fishing village. Well, and they got destroyed. They got destroyed because, I don't know if you've ever driven to the Keys, but there's this 18-mile stretch. And, there was a lot, and these are, I think it is important for us as creatives to help our communities understand what we balance. But, it was a two-way street, and people were having head-on collisions, so they needed to expand the highway so that more people wouldn't collide into one another. But in doing that, for the 18 miles of roadway, they destroyed 18 miles of mangrove forest and ecosystems forever. And I imagine that people who would be driving there wouldn't realize they were driving on what used to be mangroves, which is why we keep on developing and developing. And I thought to create a modernist grid all over South Beach, which was a mangrove forest. Miami Beach was a barrier island with mangroves. And in it, I put these human-made objects, clear cups, clips, and invited the community to collect mangroves, be inside a mangrove forest, understand its power, its richness, and then create these vertical nurseries that then themselves would plant. The important part is, again, I think what's important about the practice is that volunteers collected the seedlings, volunteers persuaded the barista at Starbucks and the manager to hang them on the windows. We did this for a decade. And then the barista would be the person telling the person who just ordered a latte what these cigar-shaped things were hanging on the window. And hundreds of thousands of people saw this, and acres of mangroves were then planted by these volunteers, creating ecosystems above and below the waterline. So I think that kind of, in a world that can paralyze you because it feels like it's daunting, giving you agency and giving you purpose and doing it collectively, like Dr. Atkinson mentioned this morning, I think is important. And that's what my latest projects are about. Right now at the underwater, if you go to the next slide, the underwater is a project. I'm actually pretty proud of it. I won a 2022 Creative Capital Award to help implement it. And along with my research team over at the University of Miami, I'm a professor in the art department. I'm working with a climate scientist, the person who oversees our environmental law program at the law school, an economist, to try to help Miami understand climate migration. And like every place where land touches water, Miami is a vulnerable community. If you look at that little map on the slide, there's a coastline that you imagine, the Atlantic Ocean, but Miami has the Everglades on its west side. It's a river. It's the River of Grass. That's our second coastline. And I wanted Miamians to understand that it's not just the people at the water's edge who tend to be wealthier. People who live in coastal waterfront land are wealthier than people who live inland in a 2-hour drive to downtown, right? So the people who lived inland had no idea how vulnerable they were. So I took the same Antarctic, by the way, thanks for launching this at Peabody Essex, right? Look how far I've gone with your paintings. So I took those very ice paintings and used them as markers. And conceptually, I wanted people to understand what their elevation was, how many feet above sea level. And in the last slide, I just wanted to share with you, I created them as markers, and I had people put them in their front homes, not a for sale sign, not a, vote for me, or vote for my political ideology. Antarctica doesn't care who you vote for. It's still coming. And I literally put Antarctica, these ice paintings are literally a piece of Antarctica. I put Antarctica in their front yards. And when enough glacier melted so that water, that little squiggly line at the bottom, came to the number on that yard sign, your elevation, how many feet above sea level you were, that meant that you were getting flooded. And then I worked with communities, with high schools and people to create a way of marking their elevation across the community. So we painted across the transect, east to west. And what people realized is that, sure, they were at lower elevations at the water's edge, but as you moved inland, the ridge gave you rise, but then the ridge ended and you were back at flatland towards the Everglades.
Right.
And that prompted something called the Underwater Homeowners Association. It's a group where, brought in scientists and practitioners to come in and problem solve. And at the end of the day, I think that's what we want to do, right? Find creative approaches to help people reframe, see things differently, and help us imagine, sort of a different reality. What do you find, Janie, as we can stop the slides if you want, but what do you find is the sort of like the challenges that in your practice, in your museum, and with your colleagues in trying to do this kind of engaged work that can inspire action, problem solving?
Right, and I feel like sometimes it's a fine line between terrifying people and inspiring action, and that is a gray area that some people are going to be more toward one end than the other. And so I think where I find myself coming from is I just have to go back to my heart center. One of the things that I think was really valuable to me over the time since you and I first worked on this, Xavier, was doing my own personal consciousness work. Like, to take these things on, I had to know where I was, and that I wasn't going to be operating from a place of reaction, but that was going to be grounded and clear about what I was doing, what I was proposing, how I was interacting with our team about content that was very challenging at times. And what did I want to come out of it? And so that's one of the ways that I feel like I needed that grounding to get to the point where then I could say, oh yeah, let's take on this suite of 4 exhibition projects, which, believe me, I'm not doing alone. And working.
I think that's legitimate, right? I think that's a legitimate approach. I mean, in many ways, what I try to do, we're trying to model behavior, change systems, but we also need to be grounded and need to be able to adapt as we go. And if you look at your peers, your institution, there's a role as to what you're going to do with your exhibit, but isn't there also a role about what your institution is going to do through time, right? Like by you programming, you're not just programming for the audience in front of you now, you're programming for the institution that's going to be around 100 years from now. And in my way of thinking is these institutions, right? Museums have so much, they can have so much power just by the board membership. If you can begin to model behavior that these board members can then take to their corporations and their institutions and model them there, then you begin, I think, to have a little bit of a domino effect. And also, I think you need to walk the walk before you can talk the talk. And I think we've seen that lately in the last few years, how important it is that museums do get it right? Isn't that one of those, yeah?
Well, certainly for me, it felt like as part of this initiative, we needed to be taking on what we were doing institutionally. And that was brought up wonderfully earlier today too, by colleagues of the, so we have a group that we formed in the museum called the Climate and Environment Ideators. And that's a cross-departmental team. It's totally voluntary. And it's another place for, it's an energizing thing. I go in there and we're talking with these other people and they're coming up with all these ideas. It feels like, yeah, there's things we can do. There's things we are doing, and there's opportunities out there. So that has been, I feel like, a really important part of the initiative. And it's a way for people who might not otherwise have an outlet, like working on an exhibition, to be able to have positive impact. And having our chief financial officer come and talk to the team about our investments at the museum level. Yep. And her being really pleased to come in and talk to us about that. Not like, we didn't have to be dragging her in, like, here's where we're at, here's what we might be able to do. And then, I've been at the museum long enough to really see the change at the senior leadership level in relation to these ideas. And now with the executive director we have in place and the rest of the senior leadership really embracing, not only do we want to do this, this is important for the institution to do this. And so that's been a real, change over time.
That. Yeah, in many ways, it's a similar role that I take on as an artist, and it's just understanding your power. If you can own that for a second, just own the word power for a second. And by power, I mean your ability to influence because of some positive you can deliver that allows those others to follow. And in the case of museums, you should be closer to your audience and its changing demographics more than anyone else. I mean, you have your ear, I hope, to the ground, and you understand, what's relevant, but also you understand that by bringing that knowledge, that, let's call it community knowledge, that wisdom into the museum, you help the museum adapt. And the questions I think are out there. They've been out there for a while. What are the roles of museum? Are they trusted institutions? Are they relevant? Are they essential in our community? And how so? How are they adapting to the present day? How relevant are you? What kind of impact do you have? And if you can find a way of, in your programming, using the power as creatives, right? Using the power that you have to influence decisions, but to also lead, to shine a light into where that institution is supposed to go so that it's relevant in changing times, then you can not only address the audiences and the programming of today, but I think you change the institution itself and safeguard it, for the better, right?
Well, yeah, but we couldn't do that without the work of like what you're doing, Xavier. Like, that's where the vision comes. There can be the idea, but the vision, even with climate action, really came out of seeing the works that artists were creating, and very few of them were identifying themselves as climate artists.
Yep.
So having to go, down lots of alleyways to see what would work within this, we had to be creating something that would be highly accessible. And so it's, in my mind, the role that when I'm a co-curator or a curator for a project is, how do we create the least barrier between the visitor and you as an artist, so that people can be really experiencing what it is you're doing and what you're offering? And so, I'd be interested from your perspective as an artist who's working with you work with a lot of different institutions. What is it you're kind of looking for from institutions? Like, how do you make those connections with institutions? Or what would you like to be seeing institutions doing more of in this arena, like museums and other cultural centers?
Sure. So I think I want to tell you that I have this insane sense of urgency, and I also work with slow activism. So it sounds like an inherent conflict, but I can live with both. And I think I want institutions that have the same approach, that they understand that we are at the current rate promising but not doing anything about it, putting 14% more carbon in the atmosphere as promised by COP26, when we are supposed to be reducing our fossil fuels by 45% during this decade. So we're supposed to reduce it 45%, but we're promising to increase it 14%, but we're not even doing that. We're going way beyond that. Environmentalists sound like radicals, but to quote the UN Secretary General, the radicals are the nations that continue subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. So I, as an artist, don't care about the art market. I don't, all I care about is using the power of art to help transform society. And I think if curators could behave in that same way, which is a radical, but when 1.5 degrees Celsius sentenced 500 million people to death, and we are not even close to approaching that, and scientists tell us we need to meet that by this decade, then I think it's our duty as curators and as artists to do all we can. So what do I want in an institution? I want an institution that's real, right? That's real about it, and that understands the power that it has to convene and to transform. And I also want a curator. Let me just throw it back at you. I think curators, in many ways, it's almost like Walmart. Walmart can I'm sorry to equate the two, but Walmart.
Yeah, that's quite a comparison.
Walmart can literally decide how shipping is done in the United States. They have it in their power to mandate how sustainable the supply chain is going to be. I know this sounds really absurd. At least for me, it sounds really absurd, but curators have that same power in determining the kind of art that is celebrated and elevated and validated in our society. They literally can define what artists make, because artists are so interested in being a part of the art world / art market, because that is the silo that we have diminished art into. And if curators and artists can understand that the art world is so much bigger than the art market, and that what happens inside a museum can have transformative effects. It doesn't have to do anything with ticket sales or what the kind of stuff that board members want, but by the power and vision that you have, you can transform that institution and make it really, really relevant and have the kind of impacts that we need to have in a world that is at the precipice of catastrophe. Then I think we are a museum that's not about collecting, but catalyzing, a museum that's not looking backwards, but leading forward. And I believe that the only real person inside a museum that has the power to do that and to challenge is the curator. I really do. So I
hope everybody appreciates that.
I think it's true. I really do. I know that everyone else has numbers and patrons and all of these other things that happen across every other sector of society. I literally work with all sectors of society, but it's the creatives, and the curators are the creatives inside a museum. It's the creatives that can challenge and reframe and help us see differently. So what do I look for? I look for those type of creatives that I can dream with. And last time, I did that at the Science Museum with the Reclamation Project. We embedded it there, and the Science Museum transformed its own culture. Part of the programming at Miami Science Museum is my original Reclamation Project. People plant trees as a museum experience. So
that's think so awesome.
It's called Museum Volunteers for the Environment. So I think that's as we sit here today in 2022, Janie, and we have a room full of people who really program how we're going to inspire communities to respond to the challenge of our time. I want to be radical, but radical in the essential way, as the UN Secretary says. The radical in let's save our institutions, our planets, our suns, And I think art has a beautiful way of convening and help us do that.
Well, I want to jump in here for just a sec, just to say how, I think both you and I would say that it is so important for museums that are working in the art realm to take this topic on, because there's ways that we can be connecting with audiences and communities that's different from a science-focused institution. Yes. And so in my experience, the feeling like reaching somebody at that place where they are listening, like deep listening. And that is, in a way, it's kind of a terrifying place to go for people in this arena. So offering ways that people can do that, which I really feel like you do. Some of your work is quite playful. Yeah. And so there's a way that people can go there with you and be with you and talk about it, that it's not like a bottomless pit. And that is, I don't want to take anybody to a bottomless pit. I don't think you do either.
No, I think that paralyzes you and that leads to inaction. But you just have to be aware of the reality. Look, millennials are about experiences. They're not their grandparents. They're not about collections. They're not looking at 2D stuff on a wall. And I know you don't. I know museums don't do that. But if you can understand that what you're trying to do is deliver an experience, a challenging experience that really makes you think. But deliver an experience that piques your curiosity, that lets you explore more and more, that literally transforms you just because you walked into a museum or participated in its program. Then you've done your job. And again, by giving you agency, this problem is really, really huge. And at the end of the day, what we want is systemic change. That's what we need. We need the one thing we need, and I know it sounds really sort of like almost didactic, but we just need to stop pumping carbon into the atmosphere or people will die. So if we can explain that in a way that gives you agency and doesn't make you get paralyzed, and understand that you have a role in changing your government and changing your society and working with your local city hall, then I think we do better. And that's what we did in Miami. In Miami, I just put 2,500 yard signs in Little Havana, my old high school. I graduated from there 40 years ago. We went into the classroom, we gave 84, 90-minute presentations. We got the service club all excited, and now they're putting signs all over Little Havana talking about elevation. So that's playful, that's joyful, that's interesting, but it's talking about literally climate refugees and the climate crisis facing Miami. And I think there's inspiring ways. I don't know if inspiring ways was doing that. What have you learned along the way? Like what are you doing differently than when you and I were together back in 2008, 2009?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things I'm doing, the biggest thing is the sense of not backing away from the challenge of it. So that when I'm sensing that like, this is just too much, thinking, okay, well, how do I work around that instead of being stopped by it? And working, like not trying to reinvent the wheel. Like there's a lot of people who are doing really great work, and bring them in. The experts, the community members, the students, so that's a place that I go for like ideas, for also to test out a notion, which I feel is really important with some of this, to make sure that there isn't an aspect that I'm missing. So yeah, those are things those are two things that come to mind as that have been really important, like much more involvement with other individuals. And I think I got the signal that we're at like needing, yeah, that's the signal. So opening it up for questions, that went by way too fast. And Xavier, I could talk to you for 2 hours without even covering the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. Yeah, I know that was bad. So now we are opening up to questions from all of you for Xavier or myself, or both of us. Otherwise, we'll just keep talking.
I have a question for Jane, which is that within the museum and the new initiative, and you were saying that staff from different departments, it's everybody's welcome to join. And so are there some things like steps or actions or organizing principles or anything that you can offer those of us who would like to kind of mimic that in our own institutions?
Yes, I mean, I think one of the things I would mention is we decided with our climate and environment initiative that we would take it on as an iterative process and not lay too much out at the beginning that then we had to like implement, but see where this was taking us. And so we did a brainstorming session and put all the ideas together so that we could see, well, what is it that resonates for the people that are part of this group, which gets back to that aspect for me of, we can put all kinds of things down on a piece of paper, but if someone isn't like willing to champion it, it's just gonna be a good idea. So working from the individuals, that those are the people that volunteered, they're the ones that are going to be putting time into this kind of as a starting point. And then we were developing something that someone on the team came up with as a climate and environment intranet site, so that we can put different categories of things, whether, identifying where the sources of funding, which is so important to know, well, this may be a great idea, but who would help make that possible? So having different categories for funding, for facilities, for exhibition ideas, programming, food services, so we can put things there, and then also an FAQ page, so that then this will be available for all the staff. And we can track what are the things we've already done, as well as things that are underway. Because in some of these larger institutions, things are going on we just don't even know about. So making sure people are aware that actually there are things that are happening in addition to what we want, ideas going forward.
I would add the word choreographer to that list too. And by that, I mean, you have the convening power to understand what music, or you can even set the music, your broader community and other systems in your community are in. You as a museum can really transform the way a community addresses climate. So bringing in the other dancers, from government, from the private sector, from education, and trying to create a dance that everyone can connect with, I think is probably the biggest role. And within your institution, as you just said, would be one of the biggest roles a curator can have. Curator as choreographer.
And putting it out there, not knowing necessarily what this would look like, but wanting to be seen as a community hub for this.
Absolutely.
And so how that emerges out of the process of these different exhibitions and programs, and that would be different for any institution. But that's been a valuable thing to have, like, front of mind is what are we doing that can serve the community, where the museum can be seen as a creative hub for these topics. Other questions out there or suggestions, struggles?
I think, is someone looking at, raising a hand there somewhere? No, I just want to say this, maybe as people are thinking, look, just the way you look at technology right now, you can't order soup without your smartphone, right? Like everything is technology, every single thing we do to get on a plane, anything and everything. I want us to understand that we have a future that climate will be everything. There will be nothing that we do and no decision we make at a household level, at an institutional level, systemic level, that will not address climate. We are living through the hottest summers in recorded history, just in this century alone, in recorded history. And it's only going to get warmer. And there's going to be more extreme weather. And so the entire planet is going to understand the role of climate. And I think institutions like an art museum is a trusted institution. It's got long history in it, and it captures and conveys the culture, the way our societal mores, who we are as people, right? That's what a museum is. It's that repository of culture. So I just want us to understand that we're sitting here as cultural leaders looking at everything that's going to matter to our society for centuries to come. It's climate. There's nothing else but climate. That is all that's going to matter to our society. And I just want us to be prepared to lead, not to react. And that's, I think, what the big challenge is. And that's why I'm so proud to have been with you, Janie, many years later, sort of, closing this session in a room full of curators who will hopefully help our communities lead the way.
Yeah, and I think feeling that the aspect of there isn't one way to go about this is so important to me, to be communicating that, recognizing you all have your own institutions. This is a moment that we can really make a difference. So just like you were saying, Xavier, so climate change is happening. And for some people that's been like, okay, that's it. It's happening, it's too late. And with, for example, with climate action, one of the key messages about this has been climate change is happening, but it's going to happen at one level if we don't do something, and it's going to happen at a completely different level if we engage with this. So the aspect of engagement and agency is like so vital right now. And thinking about, well, what does that mean at whether you as an artist, me working in a curatorial role, me as a climate citizen, you as a climate citizen, where can we be making a difference and starting from there? I mean, I think that's, I think, you know, that gets back to your slow activism,
Yeah, right.
right? You start with where people are.
Yeah.
And that's all we can do. And this isn't about, you know, waving a flag, although I know you've worked with flags.
A lot.
but much more about like meeting people where they are and having compassion for that. And then knowing we are in this together. So what is it we can do together?
And speaking of compassion, of course, the poor will suffer first and they will suffer more. So there's a lot of intersections when we deal with this. One of the earlier questions in the panel, the last one had to do with environmental justice. Clearly, those homes in the western part of Miami are the ones that have the lower income individuals. So we also have, I think, a moral duty. Like, what kind of society and culture are we, and how do we respond? And of course, art has been there. One of my earlier works were the AIDS murals. As a gay man, I was very sensitive to what was happening to our community in the early 90s. And I started creating these murals at World AIDS conferences, the civil rights movement. Again, artists have responded to that. Through time, art has been a way of recording, but also catalyzing responses to injustices. This is the injustice of our time and is propagated on us by structures and systems that we are blind to. So let's use art to make that invisible visible, and let's mobilize our communities with the power of art to imagine more equitable solutions.
Yeah.
I have a question from our virtual audience. What initiatives and efforts, non-art institutions, organizations, and businesses would either of you recommend we join?
I believe the Union of Concerned Scientists is a good place to go. I believe that for those, I know there's many curators who are in college museums. I would really encourage you to run to your interdisciplinary centers or your biology department and find fellowship with art and science relationships there. Each of your communities, I hope, maybe not, but I hope have resiliency officers or an office within government. The same government that helps fund your museum through grants should hopefully be regulating the environment. I think you find fellowship there, you build it locally, and then there's national groups that you can you can connect to. In the scientific community, the National Science Foundation has long-term ecological research projects that have fused art and science. Those are great places for you as curators to begin working with the scientific community and the artists that work with scientists. There's a myriad of places. And, as a shameless plug, if you go to cortada.com/underwater, a little QR code, I have a section called the Intel section. And that talks about climate justice, science, art. I profile several of my favorite environmental artists there. Betsy Damon, Mel Chin, Brandon Vanderley, in the site. So there's, just in my site alone, you can see a bunch of websites and blogs and people who are making it different. And I am so sure Peabody Essex has so much more than that.
Well, you're in a good position to be advocating for specific organizations. That's a place that gets a little tricky because as an institution to be recommending this organization or that organization, because that can easily be like, well, why didn't you mention this other place? We're doing amazing work. But I will mention, especially since we're here in New York City, just the Climate Museum, which we partnered with for the Climate Action Inspiring Change, is a really fantastic resource as well. They do art and science, but they're really focused on a community engagement and cultural solutions to climate. And I did just get the flag of that we're out of time. And I just want to thank all of you for staying on to the end and being here with Xavier and myself to participate in this conversation, which was really special for me because you've been someone, Xavier, who has really been an inspiring individual and boundless energy throughout this. And I'm sure that's not always been how you have felt, but that's how it always comes across to me. So thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for being here with us.
And Janie, I just want to celebrate you because at a pivotal time, right after I got back from the polls, there you were, not just inviting me to show my work, but allowing me to engage your community with the work. And that was a catalyst for my success. So own it, because I want us to model what it is that a curator and artist can do together to help effectuate change. Thank you for doing that for me.
Thank you. Bye for now, Xavier.